They had done this before. Vandalized homes, torched businesses, forced families to flee. When they chose her house, they thought it would be like all the others. Another black woman, alone, another victim. They didn't know Olivia Johnson had spent years hunting warlords in deserts and dismantling terror cells in jungles. They didn't know she was Delta Force. To them, she was just a woman in a quiet neighborhood. They were wrong, and by the time she was finished, they would know exactly who they had chosen to cross. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The night was still, the kind of quiet that only settled over a neighborhood long after midnight, when even the hum of distant traffic faded into a low, indistinct murmur. The distant sounds of sirens, occasional car alarms, and restless voices from street corners had all disappeared into the late hour, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Even the wind had ceased its low howling, and the trees outside stood motionless in the dim glow of the streetlights. Olivia Johnson lay motionless in bed, her breathing slow and even, her body at rest but never truly relaxed. The years had conditioned her to sleep lightly, always lingering just beneath the surface of consciousness, alert to the subtlest shifts in her surroundings. Even in the depths of sleep, she remained tethered to reality, her instincts honed to respond to danger before her mind could even fully process it. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. The soft whir of the ceiling fan droned overhead, blending into the familiar rhythm of the house. The faint hum of the refrigerator cycling, the slow, methodical ticking of the clock on the wall, the subtle creaks of the old wooden floor settling. It was a rhythm she knew, a cadence she had memorized over time. She could tell when something was out of place, and then something shattered downstairs. A sharp, violent crash. Her eyes snapped open instantly, the fog of sleep vanishing as though it had never been there at all. Every muscle in her body tensed in an instant. The trained instincts she had spent years refining kicked in, overriding the groggy remnants of sleep. No hesitation, no second-guessing. She moved fluidly, her body reacting before her mind could formulate a plan. One hand reached under her pillow, fingers closing around the cool grip of her weapon. The solid weight of the firearm was reassuring, grounding, a silent promise that she wasn't defenseless. Barely breathing, she pushed herself up, scanning the shadows of her room, her sharp eyes sweeping the darkness for any anomaly. Her mind worked through the possibilities in seconds. A break-in? A botched robbery? No, something about this felt different. She slid out of bed, her movements practiced, deliberate, near silent against the hardwood floor. Her steps made no sound as she moved, each one placed with the careful precision of someone who had done this before, because she had. In darker places, under far more dangerous circumstances, this wasn't new. Fear didn't control her. The sound had come from the front of the house. She moved swiftly, gun raised in a steady grip as she eased into the hallway. The air was still. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, no voices whispering in the dark. But something was wrong. Reaching the top of the stairs, she paused, muscles coiled, senses honed. The moonlight filtered through the large front windows, casting pale silver streaks across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that hung in the still air. But as her eyes adjusted, something else caught her attention. Her pulse slowed, then settled into something colder, more controlled. The words, big, bold, sloppy strokes of spray paint streaked across her windows and walls, thick letters dripping down the glass like open wounds, slurs, hate, a message. Her stomach clenched, but her face remained impassive, unreadable, as she stepped forward, gaze sweeping over the wreckage. The porch was littered with broken glass, beer bottles, bricks, shards scattered like discarded remnants of someone else's rage. The door bore deep scratches, an ugly testament to their intent. This wasn't random. A slow breath filled her lungs as she exhaled, measured and deliberate. The pounding of approaching footsteps broke the silence, followed by the abrupt strobe of red and blue flashing against the broken glass. The pulsing lights cast jagged, flickering shadows over the wreckage, painting everything in a chaotic dance of crimson and cobalt. The sound of a police radio crackled faintly through the still air. The murmur of indistinct voices blending with the distant hum of an engine left idling. A patrol car rolled up to the curb, tires crunching softly against the asphalt. 2 officers climbed out, their postures relaxed, their movements unhurried. There was no urgency in their approach, no sense of alarm in their body language. They moved with the lazy disinterest of men who had already decided this wasn't worth their time. She holstered her weapon as they approached, their eyes barely flickering to the damage before they turned their attention to her. "You call this in?" the older one asked, not unkindly, but without urgency. His voice carried the weight of a long shift, the weary detachment of a man who had seen too much but cared too little. "No," Olivia said, voice cool, controlled. "But I figured someone else would." The officer looked at his partner, a barely perceptible exchange passing between them before he pulled out a small notepad. He licked the tip of his pen, the small motion oddly slow, almost lazy, as if this were just another routine call. "What time did you notice the damage?" "Just now." "You see anyone?" She shook her head. "Any security cameras?" "Yes." "We'll take a look at the footage." The officer scribbled something down, flipping through his notepad with an air of disinterest. "Probably just some kids messing around. Happens more than you'd think." Olivia's grip tightened at her sides, but she kept her expression neutral. "Not random," she corrected. "Look at what they wrote. That wasn't kids messing around." The officer let out a slow breath, nodding absently as if to placate her. "Yeah, well, unfortunately, unless we catch them in the act, there's not much we can do. Even if we do get something from the footage, it's tough to make an ID in the dark." She knew that tone. It meant this was already a cold case in their minds. The second officer sighed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hands hovered over his duty belt, his fingers idly adjusting his radio as he glanced at the mess of broken glass and slurs defacing the house. He didn't bother writing anything down. "We'll file a report. If anything else happens, give us a call." And that was it. A few notes, a few half-hearted reassurances, and then they were back in the car, the flashing lights disappearing into the distance, leaving Olivia standing in the wreckage of their apathy, alone. The silence settled once more, heavy and suffocating, but this time it wasn't the stillness of a sleeping city. It was something else, something heavier, something cold. Her fingers curled into fists, nails pressing against her palms as the weight of it settled in. They weren't going to do anything. This wouldn't be investigated, wouldn't be prioritized, because it was her. Because this wasn't the kind of crime that stirred outrage from the right people. Her heartbeat was steady, slow, controlled, but beneath the surface, something simmered. She exhaled, forcing the emotion into something sharper, something more useful. They wanted to scare her. They wanted to intimidate her. They wanted her to feel helpless. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She turned back toward the house, her mind already shifting gears. Tomorrow, she would go through the footage, dissect every frame, find anything that could give her an edge. She would make them regret this. The police weren't going to handle this, but she would. The acrid scent of spray paint and burnt plastic still lingered in the air, seeping into the walls like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Olivia Johnson sat in the dim glow of her living room, surrounded by an array of screens casting a cold, flickering light across her face. Her television displayed security footage, looped and paused at keyframes, while her laptop processed enhancements on a grainy, still image. Her tablet lay beside her, filled with open files containing crime statistics, known gang insignias, and recent hate crimes in the area. The police had been gone for hours. The official report was filed, but she knew it would sit untouched, lost in the void of bureaucracy, waiting to be conveniently ignored. That wasn't an option for her. She had spent too many years embedded in war zones, analyzing threats, tracking enemies who believed they were invisible, dismantling hostile networks before they could strike. She had led elite teams through some of the most dangerous missions on record. She knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. And that was exactly what she was going to do. Olivia's gaze sharpened as she focused on the footage again, studying the figures moving through the shadows in the dead of night. There were 4 of them, young, male, their body language giving them away. The first moved with nervous energy, constantly shifting, unable to stay still. He was the lookout, the weakest link, the one most likely to break if pressed. The second was bulkier, more deliberate in his actions, carrying himself with a self-assured arrogance. He was the enforcer, the one who would lash out first. The third moved tentatively, always a step behind, uncertain but following orders. He was a follower, someone who didn't have the backbone to lead. The fourth, the one who had made a mistake, stepped too far into the porch light, revealing a sliver of his sleeve before retreating. Olivia zoomed in, adjusting the contrast, sharpening the edges of the image. The resolution was poor, but not useless. She honed in on a patch on his sleeve, hastily drawn, unpolished, but recognizable. Her mind worked quickly, matching it to familiar symbols she had encountered in intelligence briefings and local crime reports. She knew this group. They had been growing bolder, spreading their influence like a disease through the community. They had tagged businesses, defaced properties, harassed families, and now they had come to her doorstep, thinking she was just another name to add to their list. She exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back, releasing the tension creeping up her spine. She had spent years eliminating men who thought they were untouchable. These fools had no idea what kind of fire they had just walked into. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her focus. Instinct kicked in before conscious thought. Her right hand moved to the weapon strapped to her thigh, her body shifting slightly to the side, angling for a tactical advantage. She moved to the door in controlled, measured steps, every movement deliberate. A quick glance through the peephole confirmed the visitor, Detective Marcus Reed. She disengaged the safety, stepped back, and pulled the door open without a word. Reed entered as if he had been expecting her to call for him, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the security footage and the screens displaying her meticulous analysis. His expression tightened, the tension visible in the hard line of his jaw, the subtle clench of his fingers as he removed his jacket. "I knew you weren't going to let this go," he muttered, shaking his head as he ran a hand over his face, his shoulders rising and falling in a slow exhale. "You came to tell me to stop." Olivia's tone was flat, uninterested in pleasantries, her gaze steady, unwavering, revealing nothing. Reed turned to face her fully, crossing his arms over his chest, his stance firm, his weight shifting slightly from one foot to the other. "I came to remind you that this is my jurisdiction, not yours. You don't have the authority to run your own investigation." Her expression remained unreadable, a flicker of something crossing her face. Annoyance, frustration, or maybe just cold determination. "Neither do they." Reed let out a frustrated breath, his nostrils flaring slightly as he exhaled, the irritation simmering beneath the surface of his otherwise controlled demeanor. "Listen, I get it. If this were my house, I'd be pissed too. But you're not a cop, Olivia. You can't just— If this were your house, you'd already be tracking them down," she interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding, sharp and precise, slicing through his argument before he could finish it. He hesitated for a beat too long. That was all the confirmation she needed. Reed looked away first, turning his attention to the footage still playing on the screen, the flickering images casting shifting shadows across his face. His eyes narrowed as they landed on the insignia, recognition flashing briefly before he masked it with something more guarded. "You recognize that?" "I do," she answered, her tone steady, watching his reaction carefully, studying the way his jaw tensed, the flicker of something in his eyes before he composed himself again. "So do you." Reed clenched his jaw, his fingers pressing against the edge of the table, the tension in his shoulders evident, unmistakable. Yeah, I've been hearing some chatter about these guys. They're not just street punks. They're organized, and they're getting worse. He turned back to her, his expression serious, his voice weighted with something unspoken. That means they're dangerous, Olivia. If you go after them, they're not just going to roll over. They'll escalate. She met his gaze without flinching, her posture unmoving, her eyes locked onto his without a hint of hesitation. I don't scare easy. I know that, he admitted, shaking his head slightly, frustration and reluctant respect mingling in his features. But these aren't insurgents. You're not overseas. You can't just run an op on them like this is a war zone. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, something almost challenging. You'd be surprised how much of the skill set applies. Reed exhaled, the weight of his thoughts pressing against him, clearly torn between respecting her capability and wanting to stop her from getting herself killed. Look, I'll put some pressure where I can. But don't do anything reckless. I don't want to be the one pulling your body out of a ditch. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering, her voice as steady as ever. You won't. He studied her for a long moment, his lips pressing together as he considered saying something else, then sighed, rolling his shoulders as he turned and headed for the door, his movements deliberate, restrained. The door shut behind him, the quiet settling like a final statement. Olivia barely had time to process the conversation before her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Maya Ellis. Olivia! Maya's voice came through, tight with frustration. I just heard what happened. Why the hell haven't you gone public with this yet? Because publicity doesn't stop people like this, Olivia replied, already flipping through her files again. But it forces accountability, Maya argued. It puts pressure on the cops. We can't just sit on this. Olivia exhaled, steady and measured. Maya, if they wanted attention, they'd be loud about it. But they're not. They're working quietly, making people afraid to fight back. They don't get to hide in the shadows anymore. And I'm not waiting for the cops to handle it. I need real leads, not just headlines. Maya was silent for a beat. When you find them, don't handle this alone. Olivia didn't make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she simply said, I'll be careful. Maya didn't believe her. But she let it go. The call ended. Olivia straightened her posture, her mind already moving to the next step. She had her first lead. Now, it was time to flush them out. The hum of distant traffic was little more than a murmur, as Olivia pulled her motorcycle into a narrow alley 2 blocks away from her destination. She never parked in front of a place like this, not when she was stepping onto enemy ground. The air was thick with the familiar scent of old oil, wet pavement, and the lingering stench of stale beer that seemed to bleed out from the building itself. She swung her leg over the bike, setting her helmet down before rolling her shoulders back, loosening her muscles. Every movement was controlled, precise, a habit drilled into her from years of discipline. The bar ahead was nothing special at first glance, just another run-down establishment with cracked brick walls, a flickering neon sign struggling to stay lit, and a door that had seen more fists than maintenance. To the untrained eye, it looked like a hole-in-the-wall spot for cheap drinks and bad decisions. But Olivia wasn't untrained. She knew exactly what it was. A haven, a breeding ground, a place where men gathered when they thought no one was watching. She moved toward the entrance, her steps slow and unhurried, her head tilted slightly downward, as if she had no particular place to be. She had chosen her outfit carefully. Something nondescript, something that wouldn't make her stand out in a room full of men who weren't expecting new faces. Her leather jacket was worn, the jeans fitted but not tight, her boots scuffed enough to suggest she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. The moment she stepped inside, she was hit with a wave of thick, cloying cigarette smoke, the kind that had seeped into the very foundation of the place. The air was dense with the scent of spilled beer and sweat, the kind of filth that clung to every surface. Low-hanging bulbs cast dim, yellowed light over the room, creating long, shifting shadows as men leaned in close. Voices hushed in dark corners. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She blended. Her gaze swept the room without lingering, cataloging details the way she had been trained to do. There were about 20 people scattered throughout the space, most clustered around a few central tables. The bar itself was lined with men nursing cheap liquor in battered glasses, the kind of men whose knuckles bore old scars and whose mouths curled into sneers at anyone who didn't belong. And she didn't belong, but they wouldn't notice her. Not as long as she played it right. She moved toward the bar, claiming an empty stool at the far end, her back angled slightly toward the wall so she had a clear view of the room. The bartender didn't even acknowledge her presence as she slid a crumpled bill across the counter, ordering a whiskey she had no intention of drinking. She wrapped her fingers around the glass, letting it sit untouched as she tuned out the general noise of the room and focused on what she had come for. It didn't take long. The group in the farthest booth, 5 men, their backs hunched forward, their voices low but not low enough, were exactly who she was looking for. She kept her posture relaxed, her gaze flickering toward them only in passing, appearing disinterested while she listened. Listening was the key. People who thought they were untouchable never guarded their words. Went off without a hitch. Nobody came out, so we didn't have to do more, one of them muttered, the edge of pride in his tone unmistakable. Should have done more. Another sneered. His voice was thick with beer, the slurred vowels drawn out like he had been drinking for hours. Paint don't scare people enough. Fire does. There was a gruff chuckle, the kind that held no warmth. One family already packed up last week. 2 more are thinking about it. We keep the pressure on, and they'll clear out by the end of the month. A 4th man, broader, older, the one who seemed to carry the most weight in the conversation, leaned in slightly. Ain't just about Ridgeway. They're popping up in other neighborhoods, too. Spreading. We let that happen. We lose everything. Gotta remind people where they don't belong. Olivia's fingers curled slightly against the glass. They weren't just targeting her. They were running a campaign, an orchestrated effort to terrorize black families into leaving the neighborhood. It was bigger than vandalism, bigger than some drunken idiots acting out their hatred under the cover of night. This was a strategy, and they were winning. She exhaled slowly through her nose, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. This wasn't the time to react. Not yet, the men continued, their voices dropping even lower, forcing her to focus harder. She caught snippets, mentions of the warehouse, of preparing for the next one, of making sure they don't come back. A warehouse. It was her only lead, but it was enough. She waited a few more minutes, making sure she had gathered everything useful before finally shifting, casting a brief glance at the time on the cracked wall clock near the entrance. She finished the charade, lifting the whiskey to her lips, letting the burn barely touch her tongue before setting it down. Then, with the same deliberate, unhurried movement she had walked in with, she slid from the stool and left without a glance back. The moment she stepped outside, the cool night air filled her lungs, washing away the stench of smoke and alcohol. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had what she needed. Now, she had to follow the trail. She leaned casually against the side of the building, pulling out her phone and pretending to check a message as she waited. She didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and one of the men from the booth stepped out. Younger, maybe late 20s, wearing a black jacket with the same insignia she had seen before. He muttered something under his breath, pulling his keys from his pocket, before striding toward the lot across the street. She pushed off the wall, moving in the opposite direction, circling around the block before reaching her motorcycle. Her helmet slid into place in one fluid motion as she straddled the bike, keeping her distance as she started the engine. When his truck pulled out, she followed. Not too close, not too far. The route was winding, taking them away from the city's main roads, past residential streets, and deeper into the industrial outskirts. She kept pace, noting the turns, mapping the distance in her head. It took nearly 15 minutes before he finally pulled into a deserted lot, an abandoned warehouse. She slowed, parking her bike in the cover of the trees, shutting off the engine without a sound. From the outside, the building was barely standing. The walls lined with rust and grime, the windows boarded up, but the faint glow of lights inside told her everything she needed to know. They were here, and whatever they were planning, it ended tonight. The distant howl of the wind was the only sound as Olivia crouched in the darkness, concealed by the skeletal remains of an abandoned loading dock. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls dull under the faint glow of moonlight. It had been standing for decades, forgotten by the city, but tonight it was anything but abandoned. Faint light seeped through the cracks in boarded-up windows, the occasional shadow flickering past the gaps. Someone was inside. She had followed the gang member here, keeping her distance, watching as he parked near the side entrance and disappeared through a rusted door. There had been no guards outside, no sign of security, which told her two things. They were either arrogant or stupid. Either way, it worked in her favor. Her breathing was steady as she ran through her mental checklist. Entry points, escape routes, potential threats. She hadn't been briefed by an intelligence team, hadn't been given drone footage or satellite imaging, but she had spent years operating under worse conditions. She had trained for this. She was built for this. Silently, she moved from her cover, sticking close to the building as she approached the side entrance. The lock was old, rusted but functional. She reached into her jacket, pulling out a compact set of lockpicks, and set to work. It took less than 10 seconds before the mechanism gave way with a muted click. She slipped inside. The air was thick with dust and the faint stench of oil and mildew. A single exposed bulb flickered above, casting an eerie glow over the space. Olivia stayed low, pressing her back against the wall as she took in her surroundings. Wooden crates were stacked against the far side of the warehouse, some marked with old shipping labels, others spray-painted with symbols she had come to recognize. Several tables were positioned near the center, covered in maps, photographs, and handwritten notes. She moved swiftly, her eyes scanning the documents. Street maps were laid out, neighborhoods circled in red ink. Notes in the margins detailed families, businesses, addresses. There were photos, grainy but clear enough to show people she recognized. Maya Ellis outside her community center, an older black man locking up a corner store, a mother walking her child home from school. They weren't just targeting homes. They were targeting lives. Olivia pulled out her phone, steady hands snapping pictures of everything. Evidence, proof of how deep this ran, how coordinated it was. If she could get this into the right hands, the gang wouldn't just be facing vandalism charges, they'd be looking at organized crime, conspiracy, hate crimes. She moved quickly, skimming through additional papers. The name Ethan Hayes appeared more than once, scribbled across several documents, always at the top of directives. Whoever he wasn't just a foot soldier. He was the architect. Her focus was so sharp, so absolute, that she almost didn't hear the footsteps. Almost. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as her instincts screamed a warning. She didn't hesitate. In a single, fluid motion, she doused the overhead light with the edge of her gloved hand, plunging the space into near-total darkness. She moved swiftly, slipping behind a stack of crates, just as the door to the main entrance swung open. A sliver of light from the adjacent room spilled into the warehouse as two men stepped inside, their voices cutting through the silence. "You hear that?" one of them muttered, boots scraping against the concrete. "Nah, man, it's just the wind," the other said, but there was a flicker of doubt in his tone. They moved further in. Olivia could hear the shift in their breathing, the way they slowed their steps. They knew something was off. She calculated her options. Two men, armed, possibly. Alert? Not yet. She had no choice but to neutralize them before they alerted the others. Moving with the kind of precision only years of training could provide, she slipped out from her cover. The first man barely had time to react before Olivia struck. Her elbow drove into his throat, cutting off his startled gasp as she twisted his arm behind him, forcing him into the crate with a sickening thud. The second man spun, reaching for something at his waist. A gun or a knife? She didn't wait to find out. She surged forward, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply, forcing him off balance. A swift knee to his ribs sent him crumpling. The first man started to push himself up, wheezing, but Olivia grabbed him by the back of his collar and slammed him into the crate again, this time ensuring he wouldn't get back up. The second man groaned, trying to crawl backward, but Olivia's boot pressed down on his chest, keeping him pinned. She leaned in, voice low. "How many are inside?" His breath hitched, but he said nothing. She pressed down harder. "How many?" "6," he rasped, struggling beneath her weight. Inside, the other room, Olivia had what she needed. Without another word, she slammed the edge of her palm against the side of his neck, knocking him out cold. She straightened, breath steady, ears straining for any sign that the scuffle had been heard. When nothing came, she moved fast, slipping back toward the entrance. She had the evidence. She had the name. Now, she had to get out. As she reached the door, a low creak behind her sent a bolt of warning through her spine. She turned just in time to see another figure, larger than the others, moving toward her fast. She ducked, narrowly avoiding the wild swing aimed at her head. He was strong but untrained, relying on brute force rather than skill. She twisted, slamming a sharp kick to the side of his knee, forcing him to stagger. That half-second was all she needed. She moved in, striking twice, once to the throat, once to the temple. He dropped. Olivia didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. She pushed through the door, slipping into the night, her heart hammering but her movements calm. She didn't stop moving until she reached her motorcycle, sliding onto the seat and kicking it into gear. She sped away, disappearing into the darkness just as shouts erupted from the warehouse. They knew someone had been there, and by the time she reached home, they had retaliated. A brick lay in the center of her living room, surrounded by shattered glass. Scrawled across it in thick, jagged letters was a single word: "Leave town, or else we'll burn you and your house." Olivia stood in the wreckage of her window, her fingers flexing at her sides, the echo of her own heartbeat filling her ears. They thought they could scare her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The night air was still, heavy with the scent of broken glass and paint fumes. Olivia stood in the middle of her living room, her eyes locked on the brick lying amidst the shards, its crude, spray-painted message taunting her from where it had landed. She exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back, releasing the tension coiling through her spine. Fear was a weapon. They wanted her shaken, rattled, afraid, but fear only worked on people who hadn't already seen the worst of humanity. She was still staring at the mess when a sharp knock sounded at her front door. She knew who it was before she opened it. Detective Marcus Reed stood on her porch, his expression lined with frustration, his gaze flickering to the damage behind her before settling back on her face. "You gonna let me in, or are we having this conversation on the porch?" His voice was edged with exhaustion, his usual guarded demeanor stretched thinner than usual. Olivia didn't respond immediately, stepping aside instead. Reed entered without hesitation, taking in the wreckage with a slow shake of his head. "Hell of a message," he muttered. Olivia crossed her arms, watching as he crouched near the brick, his fingers running over the dried paint, his silence stretched, his jaw tightening slightly before he exhaled through his nose and stood. "I'm gonna tell you something, and I need you to actually listen." His voice was low, measured, but firm. "Ethan Hayes isn't just some two-bit thug running a crew of racist cowards. He's connected. He's been careful about where he steps and who he shakes hands with. And that means if you keep pushing, you're not just gonna have him to deal with. You're gonna have everyone covering for him, too." Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Are you warning me or threatening me?" Reed scoffed, running a hand over his face before fixing her with a hard stare. "I'm telling you that he's untouchable. He's got friends in high places, the kind that make evidence disappear. The kind that make witnesses recant their statements. The kind that make people who dig too deep go missing. Olivia's gaze didn't waver, and yet, here you are, telling me all this. Almost like you want me to ignore what you just said. Reed let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You're gonna do whatever you want, no matter what I say. I knew that before I got in my car, but I need you to be smart about it. I need you to understand that this isn't just about catching a gang. It's about pulling apart something bigger. If you don't do it right, they won't just come after you again. They'll bury this. And the next time they go after someone, no one will be able to stop them. She nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her, but not in the way he intended. She wasn't deterred. She was recalibrating. Who's protecting him? She asked. Reed hesitated, rubbing his jaw before sighing. I don't know exactly, but I know Hayes used to be a cop. Olivia's expression remained unreadable, but inside, a piece of the puzzle snapped into place. That's why he has insulation, she said, half to herself. Connections in the department, favors owed, people willing to look the other way. Reed nodded grimly. He left the force years ago, but he's still got pull. Not just with cops, either. Local politicians, businessmen, people who benefit from what he's doing. That's why I said he's untouchable. Olivia's lips pressed together in thought. Everyone's touchable. You just have to find the right pressure point. Reed gave her a hard look. Pressure like this gets people killed. She met his gaze, steady, unshaken. Not if I do it right. Reed muttered something under his breath, something between a curse and a prayer, before stepping toward the door. You don't owe me an explanation, but at least tell me you're not about to do something reckless. Olivia didn't answer. Reed shook his head. That's what I thought. He opened the door, pausing before stepping out. Watch your back, Johnson. She closed the door behind him, standing in the silence for a moment before turning back toward the mess. She had to move fast. She grabbed her laptop, settled onto the floor amidst the glass, and started digging. Ethan Hayes, former officer, left the force 15 years ago under murky circumstances. No official misconduct charges, but multiple complaints filed against him. Excessive force, racial profiling, coercion. Nothing ever stuck. He had transitioned into private security work, then into community protection. A phrase she was sure was just a sanitized way of saying organized harassment. His business records were mostly clean, but there were gaps. Payments coming from unknown sources, money moving through shell companies, signs of someone being bankrolled to cause problems without being traced. She dug deeper. The names tied to him weren't surprising. Businessmen with stakes in real estate, politicians with thinly veiled neighborhood revitalization plans that conveniently removed certain demographics. She kept going, peeling back layers, following every thread until she found something that stood out. A name, Brandon Hayes, Ethan's son. She pulled up everything she could on him. Unlike his father, Brandon wasn't deeply embedded in anything. No criminal record, no obvious connections to his father's network. He was young, barely in his early 20s, had attended college for a while before dropping out. His social media was sparse, nothing overtly damning, but there were hints. He had been raised in this ideology, but he didn't seem fully committed. His posts wavered between parroting his father's rhetoric and trying to distance himself from it. A crack. If Ethan was insulated by his connections, then Brandon was the weak link. She sat back, rubbing a hand over her chin. The easiest way to break an organization wasn't to attack its leader head-on. It was to find the fracture points and press until something snapped. She had her in. Now, she just had to figure out how to use it. The air was thick with the acrid scent of spray paint and burned plastic as Olivia stood outside Simmons Market. The damage still fresh. The broken windows gaped like open wounds, shards of glass reflecting the dull glow of the streetlights. Her jaw tightened as she took in the wreckage, her mind already working through the implications. This wasn't about random destruction anymore. The gang had done this deliberately, knowing exactly whose store they were targeting. They weren't just retaliating against her investigation. They were trying to break the community from the inside, forcing black business owners to pack up and leave, making room for whatever plan Ethan Hayes and his network had in mind. Olivia turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing at the nervous cluster of bystanders watching from the sidewalk. People were talking in hushed voices, some shaking their heads, others already looking away. The gang had made them afraid to react. The police wouldn't do anything, and the neighborhood knew it. Silence was the safest choice. She stepped carefully through the broken glass, her boots crunching against the fragments as she approached the entrance. Inside, the smell of fresh paint and burned plastic lingered in the air. The counter was overturned, shelves knocked over, and in the middle of it all stood Harold Simmons, his broad shoulders hunched as he picked up fallen cans and boxes. His movements were slow, mechanical, as if he were on autopilot, as if reacting to the destruction would only make it worse. Olivia didn't speak right away. Instead, she picked up a small crate of dented soup cans, setting them back onto a shelf. She knew Harold wasn't the type to ask for help, but he also wasn't the type to refuse it if it was already given. "You don't have to do this alone," she finally said, her voice measured. Harold didn't look at her as he straightened, rubbing a hand over his face. "If I don't, who will?" His voice was low, steady, but she could hear the exhaustion beneath it. She exhaled, glancing at the wreckage around them. "You knew this was coming." Harold let out a bitter laugh. "Of course I did. They've been circling for months. They've been tagging the alleys, slashing tires, scaring off customers. The moment I said no to their buyout offer, I knew it was only a matter of time before they made sure I regretted it." Olivia folded her arms, studying him. "Do you know who did it?" His jaw clenched as he looked toward the broken windows. "Does it matter? What am I supposed to do? Call the police? File a report? They'd come back the next night and burn the whole damn place down." "I'm not stupid, Olivia. You know how this works." She did. He wasn't wrong. But knowing the game didn't mean she had to play by their rules. Harold finally turned to face her, his expression hard. "I appreciate you checking in, but if you came here to ask for names, you're wasting your time." Olivia met his gaze, unflinching. "I already know where they are." Harold exhaled, shaking his head as he turned back to the mess. "Then I hope you've got a plan, because if you poke the hornet's nest without killing the queen, all you're gonna do is make them angrier." She didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small burner phone, setting it on the counter. "Call me if they come back." Harold glanced at the phone but didn't touch it. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Olivia left without another word. That night, she sat on her motorcycle, helmet off, parked a block away from the steel pit. The steel pit had already given her what she needed: names, faces, patterns of movement. She had spent the last few nights watching them, tracking where they went and what they did once they left the safety of the bar. Most of them were small-time operators, men who acted tough in groups but scattered the moment real pressure was applied. But there were others, the ones who moved with purpose, the ones who took orders instead of giving them. Those were the ones she was after. As the night deepened, she followed one of them, a man she recognized from the warehouse. He left the bar just after midnight, his steps sure, his destination planned. Olivia let him get a comfortable lead before she followed, weaving through the streets, keeping just far enough back to remain unseen. He drove for nearly 20 minutes, leading her to a desolate alley behind an abandoned restaurant on the industrial side of town. The place was a skeleton of what it once was, its windows boarded up, its sign rusted and unreadable. A single flickering streetlight cast long shadows over the cracked pavement, revealing two more men already waiting. One of them was crouched near a gasoline canister, twisting the cap off as the other held a crowbar in his grip. They weren't here for a casual meetup. This was an arson job. Olivia tightened her grip on the blade hidden inside her jacket sleeve. She could have waited, let them douse the building, gathered more evidence, but by then, it would be too late. She moved before she could second-guess herself. The first man didn't even hear her coming. She struck fast, her elbow smashing into the side of his head before he could register her presence. He collapsed instantly, the gas canister slipping from his fingers and rolling across the ground. The second man reacted quickly, raising the crowbar as he lunged, swinging wild and hard. Olivia ducked under the strike, pivoting to the side as the metal bar sliced through empty air. She seized the opening, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply until he let out a strangled yell. The crowbar fell with a dull clang, bouncing once before she drove her knee into his ribs. He doubled over, gasping. But she wasn't finished. She grabbed the back of his jacket and slammed him face first into the brick wall. The third man, the one she had been tailing, was smarter than the others. He was already backing away, reaching into his waistband. Gun. Olivia moved. The moment his fingers touched the grip, she closed the distance, knocking his arm to the side just as he fired. The gunshot rang out, the bullet sparking against the pavement as she wrenched his wrist in a brutal arc, forcing the firearm from his grasp. It clattered to the ground, and she kicked it out of reach before he could recover. He was bigger than her, heavier, and he tried to use that weight to overpower her, shoving forward with his full strength. She absorbed the impact, redirecting his momentum and sending him crashing onto his back. He groaned, winded, but she was already on him, straddling his chest as she delivered a series of sharp, precise blows. 1, 2, 3. His struggles weakened, his face bloodied, his breathing ragged. She pressed her forearm against his throat, her voice low and steady. "Who sent you?" he coughed, spitting blood onto the pavement. "You." His eyes widened over her shoulder. Olivia moved on instinct, rolling off him just as the fourth man came out of the darkness, swinging a lead pipe. The weapon whistled past her ear, narrowly missing. She dropped low, sweeping her leg out and knocking him off balance. He stumbled, cursing, but recovered quickly, bringing the pipe up again. She sidestepped, using his own momentum against him as she drove her fist into his ribs. He grunted, doubling over, but still he didn't go down. These weren't random thugs. They were trained, coordinated. That meant Ethan Hayes had upgraded his muscle. The man with the pipe lunged again. This time, she let him come. At the last second, she ducked, catching his arm and twisting it behind his back in a tight hold. He thrashed, trying to break free, but she applied pressure, forcing him to his knees. She heard movement behind her, the other men regaining their footing. They weren't running. They were regrouping. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the scent of sweat, blood, and gasoline. Olivia's muscles burned, her breath controlled and measured as she adjusted her stance. The men around her were battered, but not broken, their movements slower, their confidence shaken, but not gone. They had underestimated her, believing she would go down easily, believing she was just another target to scare off. They were learning the hard way that she wasn't running. A sharp shuffle of feet to her left gave the first warning. Olivia pivoted just in time to block a wild punch aimed at her ribs, catching the man's wrist and twisting hard. His yelp of pain barely escaped his lips before she drove her elbow into his sternum, sending him staggering backward. He clutched his chest, wheezing, eyes wide with shock. She didn't give him a chance to recover. A precise strike to the side of his jaw sent him sprawling onto the pavement, unconscious before his head hit the ground. The others hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were supposed to be the hunters. One of them rushed her from behind, but she was ready. She sidestepped, using his own momentum to redirect him into the wall. He barely had time to curse before she grabbed the back of his head and slammed it into the rusted metal siding of the warehouse. He collapsed in a heap, unmoving. The gang leader, one of Ethan Hayes' lieutenants, a thick-necked man with a scar running down the side of his face, spat on the ground. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, his breath ragged, but his stance firm. Olivia wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth, barely sparing him a glance. "Someone who doesn't scare easy." Scarface sneered and pulled a knife from his jacket. The streetlight caught the dull glint of the blade, its edge well used, the grip worn. "You should have just walked away," he muttered before lunging. Olivia had seen men like him before. Brave when they had numbers, cowards when they lost control. She sidestepped the attack with ease, catching his wrist before he could pull back. With a swift, brutal movement, she twisted his arm, forcing the knife from his grip. The blade clattered onto the pavement, and in the same breath, she drove her knee into his stomach. He gasped, doubling over, and she finished it with a sharp elbow to the back of his skull. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The last two men exchanged a look, and for the first time that night, Olivia saw fear. Good. One of them made a last, desperate attempt, charging forward with a wild swing. Olivia ducked under the sloppy attack, stepped inside his guard, and delivered a brutal uppercut to his chin. He staggered back, stunned, and she followed up with a roundhouse kick that sent him crashing into the side of the truck. He didn't get back up. The final man hesitated, backing up, his hands shaking. Olivia took a slow step forward, gaze locked on his. "Run!" she ordered, voice low, steady. He did. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders, scanning the aftermath. The fight was over. They were down, they were beaten, and they would remember this night for the rest of their lives. But it wasn't just about them. This fight wasn't just for dominance. It was a message. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and sent a single text. Anonymous. Tip: multiple gang members unconscious at the abandoned warehouse near East 47th. Weapons on site. Evidence of arson attempt. She pocketed the device and walked away. The sirens would come soon. Let the police deal with the cleanup. Ethan Hayes was furious. He stood in his dimly lit office, jaw clenched, his grip so tight around his whiskey glass that it threatened to crack. The reports had started trickling in before dawn. His men, some of his best enforcers, were found battered, broken, and barely conscious in a warehouse they had been using for months. The cops had gotten there before they could crawl away. Some were arrested. Some were too injured to run. All of them had failed. And worse, they had no idea who was responsible. No one had seen anything. No one knew how it had happened, but he did. Ethan turned, his gaze darkening as he stared at the security footage from the warehouse lot. It was grainy, taken from a distant traffic camera, but the figure was unmistakable. Olivia Johnson. She had been at the steel pit. She had been watching his men, and now she was taking them apart, piece by piece. He exhaled slowly, swirling the whiskey in his glass before taking a measured sip. Then he smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You want a war?" he murmured, setting the glass down with a quiet clink. "You've got one." The house was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Olivia lay on her back, one arm resting beneath her head, eyes closed, but mind awake. She had spent too many years conditioned to function on minimal rest, trained to listen for the faintest disturbances in her environment. The street outside was quiet, the neighborhood still, but then it came. The shift in the air, the faint scrape of shoes against concrete. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she caught it. Someone was out there. Her eyes snapped open, her body moving before conscious thought could slow her. She slid out of bed, her feet soundless against the floor, muscles fluid and controlled as she reached for the Glock resting on her nightstand. The cool weight of the pistol in her palm was reassuring, but she didn't raise it yet. Instead, she moved to the window, keeping her body pressed against the wall as she glanced outside. A shadow moved at the far end of her front yard, slipping between the trees. Another figure lingered near her driveway, partially obscured by the parked cars. They weren't just passing through. She stepped away from the window, moving swiftly through the hallway. By the time she reached the front door, the shift in the air had changed again. The atmosphere was charged, heavy. She knew what was coming. Then the sound shattered the night. Glass breaking, the whoosh of igniting flames, the sharp crackle of fire spreading across wood. Her porch was burning. Adrenaline surged as she ripped the door open, scanning the scene in an instant. Flames licked hungrily at the steps, crawling up the railing, sparks floating into the night like embers from a war zone. A Molotov cocktail lay shattered at the foot of the stairs, the jagged remains of the bottle reflecting the glow of the fire. Her training kicked in. No hesitation. She bolted for the fire extinguisher mounted just inside the doorway, pulling the pin before directing a burst of white foam at the base of the flames. The chemical spray hissed as it clashed against the fire, the heat stinging her skin as she fought to contain it. The fire was aggressive, but so was she. Within seconds, the flames began to suffocate under the weight of the suppressant, the thick smoke curling into the air before dissipating. The fire wasn't completely out, but she had stopped it from spreading. The message, however, was loud and clear. They weren't trying to intimidate her anymore. They wanted her gone. She scanned the darkness, but the figures she had seen earlier were already gone. Their work done. The only evidence of their presence was the damage they left behind. The distant wail of sirens grew closer, their flashing lights reflecting off the shattered glass as a patrol car screeched to a stop at the curb. The officers stepped out cautiously, their eyes sweeping the scene. But before they could approach, another car pulled up behind them. Detective Marcus Reed. He slammed his door shut, his stride purposeful as he made his way toward her. His expression was tight, controlled, but she could see the frustration brewing beneath it. "Jesus Christ, Olivia," he muttered, his gaze flickering from the burned porch to the extinguisher still in her hand. "Are you okay?" She gave a curt nod, lowering the canister. It didn't spread. Reed exhaled sharply, dragging a hand over his face before turning toward the officers. "Get the area locked down. Check for any cameras that might have caught something." One of the officers hesitated. "Detective? We both know we're not gonna do it anyway," Reed snapped. The officer nodded, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. Reed turned back to Olivia, his hands settling on his hips. "This is exactly what I warned you about. They're escalating." She set the extinguisher down, brushing soot from her hands. "I noticed." His frustration deepened. "Damn it, Olivia. This isn't just vandalism anymore. They set your house on fire. What's next? A bullet through your window? You think you can fight off every single one of them?" She met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I think if I stop now, they win." Reed exhaled, shaking his head. "You're not a damn superhero. You don't get to take down an entire operation by yourself. Then why haven't you stopped them?" His jaw clenched. "You know why." They stood in silence for a long moment. The sirens faded into the distance, the officers finishing their report with the same detached efficiency as they always did. Olivia knew how this would go. A report would be filed, a brief investigation would be opened, and nothing would come of it. Reed ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, his exhaustion evident. "Let us handle this." She crossed her arms. "Like you handled the last attack?" His nostrils flared slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he dropped his voice, stepping closer. "I know you, Olivia. I know you think you can outmaneuver them. But these people don't play by the same rules. You're making them desperate." "Good." He let out a quiet curse. "That's not what I meant. Desperate men don't think. They don't hesitate. And when that happens, people die." She looked back at the scorched wood of her porch, the thick scent of burned fuel still lingering in the air. They had already decided she was a problem. There was no going back now. She turned back to Reed. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus, but I'm not backing down." His expression darkened. "Then at least tell me what your next move is." She didn't answer. He let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's what I thought." He took a step back, nodding toward the damage. "Get your house fixed. And for the love of God, be careful." She watched him leave, his tension written in every step. Once he was gone, she turned back toward the wreckage, her mind already working through the next step. They wanted to remove her. They wanted to silence her before she could unravel more of their operation. That meant she was close. Too close. If she wanted to end this, she needed leverage, a crack in Ethan Hayes's armor, and she knew exactly where to start. The gym smelled like sweat, rubber mats, and protein powder. The rhythmic pounding of a speed bag mixed with the occasional clang of weights being racked. The air was thick with the grunts of exertion, the dull thud of gloves against heavy bags, and the hum of conversations floating between training partners. It was a place where people came to burn off frustration, to carve themselves into something stronger. Tonight, Olivia wasn't here to train. She had spent the last 2 days gathering information on Brandon Hayes, where he spent his time, who he associated with, whether he was actively involved in his father's organization or simply a byproduct of it. He was a known presence in the steel pit, but he wasn't one of the men who orchestrated attacks. He wasn't on the front lines, nor did he appear in any of the more violent gatherings. Unlike his father, he didn't thrive in the shadows of intimidation. That made him a liability. And if she was right, it also made him a crack in Ethan's foundation. She spotted him near the squat racks, taking a brief pause between sets. His hands rested on his thighs, his breathing steady but labored. Tall, lean, built like a fighter, but not a soldier. He had a disciplined stance, but his expression lacked the sharp-edged brutality of the men who worked under his father. There was something else in his posture, something that Olivia recognized. Doubt. She adjusted the fit of her hoodie, pulling it slightly forward to conceal more of her face before moving toward him. If she approached him wrong, he would shut down immediately. He would recognize hostility, recognize questioning, recognize someone digging too deep. What he wouldn't recognize, what he wasn't trained to resist, was familiarity. She played her angle before she even got within a few feet. "Damn," she muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. "I know I'm not supposed to say anything, but your form's gone soft." Brandon straightened, turning toward her, his brows furrowing in immediate confusion. His eyes flickered over her face, recognition sparking but uncertainty lingering. He didn't know her, but she had presented herself as someone who knew him. Hook, line, sinker. His expression shifted slightly, not hostile, but not entirely open. "Do I know you?" Olivia smirked, tilting her head as if she were debating whether or not to play along. "Probably not well enough to remember," she admitted, letting her stance remain relaxed. "But you used to train at Henderson's gym a few years back, right?" His eyes narrowed slightly before he nodded. "Yeah, for a little while." She feigned mild amusement. "That's what I thought. I used to spar there too. Never in the same weight class, though." She let the moment settle, let him process the possibility before adding, "You had a mean left hook. Used to give some of the guys hell with it. That got him." He huffed out a quiet laugh, some of his initial tension easing. "Yeah, well, I guess I lost my edge." Olivia leaned against the rack, casual, unthreatening. "Happens when you stop training with people who challenge you." Brandon exhaled, rolling out his shoulders before picking up his water bottle. "So what? You just walk up to random people and critique their form?" She smirked. "Only when I recognize potential getting wasted." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as he took a sip of water. "Yeah, well, life's got a way of pulling people away from what they're good at, and there it was. She didn't push yet. She let the silence sit, let him think she was just making conversation. She needed him to talk first, to let out something real. "Figured you'd be one of those guys still fighting," she said after a beat, her tone light but calculated. "You had the mindset for it." Brandon ran a hand over the back of his neck, shifting slightly. "Yeah, well, my old man had other ideas." Olivia tilted her head, watching him closely. "His ideas or yours?" His expression flickered, but he covered it quickly, shrugging as he leaned against the rack. "Doesn't matter, does it?" "It always matters." Brandon scoffed, but it wasn't with confidence. It was deflection. He shook his head, looking away. "You don't know my dad." That was where he was wrong. She kept her voice measured. "I know the type." Brandon exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening around the water bottle. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend his father, but he couldn't. Whatever loyalty he once had, it was fractured. Olivia had seen it before in soldiers who had lost faith in their commanding officers. They followed orders out of obligation, not belief. She leaned in slightly. "You don't have to be him, you know." His eyes snapped to hers, sharp, almost defensive. "I never said I was." She raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you acting like someone's keeping score?" He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his throat working as if he was about to say something, but stopped himself. The seed was planted. She pushed off the rack, adjusting her hoodie. "Well, it was good seeing you again, even if you don't remember me." Brandon hesitated. He didn't want the conversation to end, but he also didn't know why. "Yeah," he said after a beat, nodding slightly. "You too." She left without looking back, her heart steady, her mind already working through the next steps. He was doubting. She had cracked the armor. Now she just had to break it. The digital world had its own battlefields, and Olivia had spent enough time around intelligence operatives to know how to navigate them. The gang operated through layers of encrypted communication, their messages buried under firewalls, masked IP addresses, and throwaway accounts meant to disappear after a single use. But no system was perfect. She sat in the dim glow of her laptop screen, her fingers moving in precise keystrokes, decrypting the latest batch of intercepted messages between Ethan Hayes' crew. Most of it was routine. Territory disputes, coded discussions about who to pressure next, veiled threats aimed at local businesses that had refused to fold. Then she found it. A series of urgent exchanges, time-stamped within the last 24 hours, all revolving around a single location. Maya Ellis's community center. Olivia's eyes narrowed as she pieced the conversation together. The language was cautious but clear. This wasn't vandalism. They were planning something bigger. She's still running her mouth. Time to make an example. This one has to be public. Send a message loud enough, they'll all get the point. It wasn't just an attack. It was meant to break the neighborhood. She clenched her jaw, breathing slow and controlled as she pushed back the anger rising in her chest. Maya's community center was more than a building. It was a stronghold, a refuge for the people Hayes and his men wanted to drive out. Taking it down would do more than just cause damage. It would tell the entire neighborhood that no one was safe. She reached for her phone, dialing Maya without hesitation. The call barely rang before Maya picked up, her voice tense. "Tell me you're calling for a good reason. We have a problem." Olivia didn't waste time with preamble. "Ethan's men are coming for the center. Soon." Maya exhaled sharply, but she didn't sound surprised. "How bad?" "Bad enough that they're calling it a message." Olivia pulled up the last decrypted message, her eyes scanning it again. "They want it to be public. They want people to watch." A pause. Then Maya's voice, quieter, but no less firm. "The police won't do a damn thing, will they?" Olivia didn't sugarcoat it. "Not fast enough." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Olivia knew that Maya had fought battles before, had stood against men like Ethan, had refused to back down even when everything in the system worked against her. But she also knew that this was different. This wasn't about speaking out. It was about survival. "What's your plan?" Maya finally asked. Olivia glanced at the second monitor, where she had already begun mapping out a strategy. "They're coming in expecting resistance from you, but they won't expect it from me. You want to set a trap." "Yes." Olivia's voice was steady. "I'll be inside before they even get there. They'll think they're walking into a show of force. Instead, they're walking into an ambush." Maya let out a slow breath, and for the first time, there was something close to amusement in her voice. "Remind me never to get on your bad side. You already knew that." A brief chuckle. But then Maya sobered. "Be careful, Olivia. Ethan isn't just throwing bodies at this. If he's making a move this big, he'll be there himself." Olivia's grip tightened slightly. "Good. Saves me the trouble of tracking him down." Maya didn't argue, but Olivia could hear the weight in her voice when she finally said, "Just make sure you walk out of there." Olivia ended the call, standing as she grabbed the duffel bag by her feet. Inside was everything she needed. Tactical gear, non-lethal deterrents, a sidearm loaded with rubber rounds, and enough firepower to turn a gang ambush into a complete disaster for Ethan Hayes. She wasn't planning to kill anyone, but she was going to make sure they wished she had. The night was thick with humidity, the air buzzing with the distant sounds of the city, but Olivia wasn't focused on any of it. She crouched in the shadows of the community center's upper floor, her body still, her breathing controlled. The center was dark, the doors locked, the appearance carefully staged to make it look empty, vulnerable. It was a lie. She had positioned herself at the best vantage point, overlooking the main entrance. She had already secured alternate exits, locked down weak points, and set up deterrents that would ensure no one made it out without a fight. Then, she heard it, the low hum of approaching vehicles. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her pistol as she peeked through the window. 3 trucks, all packed with bodies. Ethan wasn't playing around. The vehicles slowed, and men poured out. They moved with purpose, some carrying baseball bats, others armed with something worse. Olivia caught the glint of metal in the streetlights. They weren't here to just break things. They were here to send a message in blood. Her muscles coiled, but she didn't move yet. Then the last truck door opened. Ethan Hayes stepped out. Even from her vantage point, she could see his face clearly. The hardened scowl, the barely contained arrogance of a man who had never been truly challenged. He moved differently from his men. More assured, more entitled. He thought he owned this city. Tonight, she was going to remind him that he didn't. He gestured for his men to move. They spread out, some heading toward the side entrances, others preparing to smash through the front. He pulled out his phone, sending what Olivia guessed was a final confirmation. She exhaled slowly, forcing her heartbeat to steady. Then she moved. She slipped out of her hiding place, her steps silent, as she made her way toward the first target. One of the gang members had just finished picking the lock on the side entrance, his focus completely on his task. He didn't hear her coming until it was too late. A swift strike to the throat stole his breath. A second to the base of the skull sent him sprawling, unconscious before he hit the ground. 1 down. She had seconds before the others realized something was wrong. She moved fast, repositioning herself, preparing for the first wave of the real fight. By the time they figured it out, it would already be too late. The air inside the community center was dense with anticipation. The silence stretched tight, like a wire about to snap. Olivia had positioned herself perfectly, hidden in the shadows above the main floor, her breathing slow, steady. Below her, Ethan Hayes and his men moved like they owned the space, spreading out, their footsteps heavy against the polished wood. They were overconfident, arrogant. They expected an easy operation, a quick destruction of the center. A message burned into the walls. They had no idea they had just walked into a war zone. Olivia exhaled slowly. Time to close the trap. She reached into the small pouch at her side and retrieved a small device, a remote trigger. A simple flick of her thumb, and the preset charges at the rear exits detonated with a controlled burst. Smoke filled the back hallways, not enough to destroy the structure, but enough to create confusion, panic, and most importantly, isolation. Shit. What was that? One of the men spun around, his weapon raised, eyes darting. Gas leak? Another muttered, coughing as the smoke spread. Ethan didn't panic. Not yet. His voice cut through the growing unease. Stay sharp. Spread out. Someone's screwing with us. That was all Olivia needed. The moment they split up, they were hers. She moved swiftly, keeping to the rafters above, her boots silent against the steel beams. One of the thugs, a stocky man carrying a crowbar, veered away from the group, his attention flicking toward the thickening haze. Olivia tracked his movements, her muscles coiling, calculating the drop. She struck hard and fast. She landed behind him, her arms snapping around his throat, cutting off his airway before he could even cry out. He thrashed, his weight shifting wildly as he clawed at her arm. But Olivia tightened her hold, using leverage over brute strength. His struggles slowed, his body sagging before he went completely still. 1 down. She lowered him to the floor and melted back into the darkness. The others hadn't noticed. She continued her hunt, weaving through the upper walkways, using the smoke and dim lighting to her advantage. Another man broke off from the group, moving toward the far entrance, his hand twitching near his gun holster. He was cautious, smart, but not smart enough. Olivia timed her attack perfectly. She struck from behind, a brutal, efficient sequence, elbow to the ribs, knee to the kidney, then a quick, sharp strike to the back of the skull. He crumpled instantly. The panic below was spreading. "Where the hell is Brian?" someone called out, voice tinged with nerves. "He was just here." Ethan's patience snapped. "Stop whispering like a bunch of cowards. Whoever's here is outnumbered, and I don't have time for this bullshit. Find them." Olivia smirked to herself. He was rattled. Good. She took out another. A knee dislocation followed by a swift chokehold. No time for hesitation. Every second she kept them disoriented was another second she was winning. Then she heard it, the click of a safety being released. Her instincts screamed at her. "Move!" She pivoted just as a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past her shoulder, sparking off the metal beam behind her. The moment of stealth was gone. They knew she was here. She dropped down from the walkway, landing in a controlled roll just as another shot shattered a window above her. Ethan's men scrambled to readjust, firing blindly into the shadows. But Olivia wasn't the one who needed to be afraid. She launched herself at the closest one, grabbing his wrist before he could fire again. A brutal twist sent his gun spinning across the floor. She followed up with a sharp, crushing blow to his solar plexus, forcing the air from his lungs before he collapsed, unconscious. Another man came at her, swinging wildly with a combat knife. Olivia dodged, sidestepping with practiced precision. She redirected his momentum, guiding him straight into a brutal counter, a strike to the elbow, snapping his arm at the joint. His scream barely had time to escape before her palm smashed into his throat, silencing him instantly. More of them rushed in. The real fight had begun. Olivia ducked, weaved, countered. She fought with the efficiency of a soldier, every movement precise, every strike designed to incapacitate. She was outnumbered, but never outmatched. Bodies hit the floor, groaning, unmoving. Ethan stood at the center of it all, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the wreckage of his men. He finally understood. This wasn't an ambush. It was a reckoning. His grip on his pistol tightened, but Olivia was already moving. She kicked out, knocking a broken chair across the floor, forcing him to step back. He fired once, a desperate shot that ricocheted harmlessly off a steel pillar. She lunged. The gun went flying, skidding across the floor. Ethan barely had time to react before she was on him. He swung wildly, his size and strength giving him power, but no finesse. Olivia absorbed the first hit, a glancing blow to her shoulder. The second strike she dodged completely, countering with a sharp jab to his ribs. He grunted, stumbling back, his arrogance unraveling. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Hayes," Olivia muttered, rolling her shoulders, resetting her stance. Ethan spat blood onto the floor, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His nostrils flared, his pride refusing to let him back down. "You think you're gonna take me down alone?" He let out a dark chuckle, shaking his head. "You're good, Johnson, but not that good." She tilted her head, flexing her fingers. "We'll see." Then they clashed. Ethan came at her like a man who had spent his life bullying his way through fights, relying on brute strength and intimidation to crush anyone who stood in his way. He was big, fast for his size, and mean, but he was sloppy, reckless, fueled by rage instead of skill. Olivia had faced men like him before, men who thought power was enough. It never was. He threw a punch, aiming for her jaw, but she sidestepped, his knuckles barely grazing her cheek. She retaliated with a precise elbow to his ribs, the impact sharp and punishing. He grunted, but didn't back down, swinging again, this time trying to grab her, to force her into his strength. She wasn't about to let that happen. She ducked low, slipping out of his grasp, and countered with a brutal strike to his knee. His leg buckled, his balance momentarily compromised, and she used the opening to deliver a sharp kick to his sternum, sending him stumbling back. His breathing grew heavier, his eyes flashing with something close to disbelief. He wasn't used to losing. Olivia didn't give him time to recover. She moved in again, fast, relentless, her fists striking with deadly precision. A jab to the side of his neck, a hammering blow to his stomach, a knee driving up into his ribs. Each hit took its toll, forcing him further onto the defensive, forcing him to realize he couldn't overpower her. But desperation made him dangerous. With a roar of frustration, he lunged, grabbing her arm and yanking her forward with all his strength. Olivia twisted instinctively, shifting her weight, trying to break free, but he used the moment to slam her against the nearest wall. The impact jarred her, pain rippling down her spine. He pressed his forearm against her throat, trying to crush her windpipe. His face was twisted with fury, sweat dripping from his brow. "You think you're gonna take everything from me?" His breath was ragged, his grip tightening. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Olivia didn't struggle. She didn't panic. She waited. Then, just as his weight shifted slightly, she drove her knee up into his groin. Ethan let out a choked gasp, his grip loosening just enough for Olivia to tear free. She turned sharply, grabbing his arm and twisting him off balance. He stumbled, and before he could recover, she drove her elbow into the side of his head, hard enough to send him crashing to the floor. He groaned, pushing up on his hands, shaking his head, disoriented but still trying to fight, still trying to hold on to his empire. She wasn't going to let him. She stepped forward and kicked him square in the chest, sending him sprawling onto his back. His head hit the concrete with a dull thud, his body heaving for air. It was over. The sound of sirens split through the night, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the walls as multiple police vehicles screeched to a halt outside. The front doors of the community center burst open, officers swarming in, weapons drawn. Detective Reed was the first through the door. His gaze swept the wreckage. The bodies of Ethan's men sprawled across the floor, groaning, barely conscious. The overturned furniture, the bullet holes in the walls, the shattered glass. Then his eyes landed on Ethan, lying on the ground, broken and defeated, and Olivia, standing over him, her breath controlled, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Reed let out a slow breath and reached for his handcuffs. He walked toward Ethan, rolling him onto his stomach, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists with a satisfying click. "Ethan Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy, arson, assault, and about a dozen other things I don't have time to list right now," Reed said, his voice laced with quiet satisfaction. "Looks like your luck finally ran out." Ethan didn't respond. He was barely conscious, his breath wheezing as Reed hauled him upright. Reed turned to Olivia, his expression unreadable. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, rolling her shoulders. "Nothing I can't walk off." Reed let out a breath and nodded toward the wreckage. "You know, there's going to be a hell of a lot of paperwork for this." Olivia smirked. "Good thing that's your problem." For the first time in a long time, Reed actually chuckled. Behind them, officers secured the rest of Ethan's men, dragging them to their feet, reading them their rights. The gang was done. Their operation was dismantled, their protection shattered. Ethan Hayes had built his empire on fear. Tonight, it had collapsed. Ethan and his top lieutenants are sentenced, their influence stripped away. Brandon Hayes testifies against his father, choosing a different path instead of following in his footsteps. The neighborhood begins to heal. Olivia's house is repaired, the scars of the battle fading, but the lessons remaining. Detective Reed acknowledges that Olivia did what the system couldn't. As the sun rises, Olivia watches the city, knowing that justice is never given. It's earned. The neighborhood changed in the weeks that followed. It wasn't overnight, wasn't dramatic, but it was felt. Maya's community center, once under constant threat, now thrived. Donations poured in, businesses that had been too afraid to stand up before now rallied together, rebuilding what had been lost. Families that had considered moving away chose to stay. The people took back their streets. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia's house felt like a home again. She had worked alongside the crew that repaired it. Workers like Luis from the neighborhood, who had grown up a few blocks away and remembered playing on this very street, and Carla, who had nearly left town but chose to stay and rebuild. They reinforced what had been broken, patched what had been damaged, replaced what had been shattered. But she hadn't erased everything. She had left a single mark, a charred section of her front porch, untouched, a reminder. Some scars weren't meant to be covered. Detective Reed found her there one evening, standing by the steps, staring at the fading light as it stretched across the horizon. He approached without his usual weight of tension, no longer carrying the frustration of being one step behind. Instead, his hands were in his pockets, his stance easy. Behind him, Officer Delgado leaned against the squad car, chatting with Patel, their voices low but relaxed, a stark contrast to the tension that had once filled this block. Across the street, Mrs. Holloway, Olivia's elderly neighbor, watered her plants, occasionally glancing their way, her watchful presence unchanged. "They're gonna be talking about this one for a long time," Reed said, glancing at the house before shifting his gaze to her. Olivia gave a slow nod, her eyes still on the sunset. "Let them," Reed exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You know, I've been a cop long enough to know how this should have gone. We arrest a few guys, they lawyer up, they disappear into the system, and nothing changes." His voice was quieter now, reflective, but this time, things actually changed. She finally looked at him, waiting. He sighed, shaking his head. "You did what the system couldn't." A rustling sound from the side of the house signaled Maya's approach, the community center leader pausing near the porch steps. She had heard those words, but she didn't interject. She just listened, her expression unreadable, the weight of too many years of struggle reflected in her eyes. Olivia smirked, tilting her head slightly. "That sound like gratitude, Detective?" Reed huffed out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Don't push your luck." He paused, then added, "But, yeah, maybe." He didn't linger after that. He nodded once and headed back to his car, passing Delgado, who gave him a raised brow but didn't say anything. Patel tossed Olivia a nod before climbing into the passenger seat, flipping through the last of their paperwork. Across the street, young Daniel, the boy who had once been too afraid to walk home alone, rode his bike past them, his laughter echoing in the cooling night. His mother, Jasmine, leaned against their porch railing, watching him with a cautious sort of relief. This was her first evening in months that she didn't glance over her shoulder every few minutes. The night stretched long, but Olivia didn't move. She watched as the last light faded behind the skyline, the city settling into a rare moment of peace. The faint chatter of voices drifted from the houses, and from the community center, music played softly. A song from a speaker Maya had left on. There would always be another battle, another threat, another fight waiting in the shadows. She knew that, but for now, this war was won. Justice had never been something handed to people like her, to communities like hers. It had always been something that had to be taken, fought for, earned. Tonight, she had earned it. And tomorrow, she would be ready for whatever came next. Because Olivia Johnson never ran. She fought, and she won. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.